I grew up on my family's farm in Arkansas, a place so deep in the countryside that the closest neighbor was miles away. My parents, my younger sister, and I lived in a modest farmhouse surrounded by acres of pasture, dense woods, and rocky hills. Life there was simple early mornings, hard work, and quiet nights. But in the summer of 1998, something changed. It started with footprints. Every morning, my dad would step out onto the porch with his coffee, only to find a fresh set of bare footprints in the dirt around our house. At first, he thought maybe one of us had wandered outside at night, but the prints were too big for my sister or me, and my parents always slept with their door locked. At first, my dad brushed it off, thinking maybe some drifter had passed through. But every morning, the footprints returned, circling the house, sometimes stopping at windows, as if someone had been standing there watching. The weirdest part? The prints never led to or from the road, as if whoever was making them appeared out of nowhere. My mom was spooked, but my dad, being the no-nonsense kind of man he was, refused to call the police over some damn footprints. So one morning, just as the sun began to rise, he grabbed his rifle, determined to follow the tracks and put an end to the mystery. He motioned for me to follow. I was only 16, but I had been helping on the farm my whole life, and he figured an extra set of eyes wouldn't hurt. The footprints led away from the house, past the barn, and toward the tree line. The grass was wet with morning dew, but the prints remained clear-wide, deep, like someone had been walking slowly and deliberately. As we moved further into the woods, a strange feeling crept over me, like we were being watched. The trees stood unnaturally still, not a single leaf rustling in the breeze. Even the birds, usually loud at this hour, had gone silent. The tracks continued for nearly a mile, weaving through the trees before leading us toward the rocky hills on the edge of our property. There was an old outcropping there, where massive boulders had settled into strange formations over time, creating deep crevices and dark pockets of space. I had played around there as a kid, but never liked the way the rock swallowed sound, making it feel like something was hiding just out of sight. My dad moved forward cautiously, his grip tightening on the rifle. Then we saw it. The footprints led directly into a narrow split between two massive rocks. It was barely wide enough for a person to slip through, and inside there was nothing but darkness. My dad hesitated for only a moment before stepping closer, peering into the darkness. I stood a few feet behind him, my stomach twisting with unease. The air that drifted out of the crevice was different, cool, damp, carrying a faint, earthy smell that reminded me of deep caves. My dad lifted his rifle, adjusting his stance, then leaned in just a little more. That's when I saw it. A flicker of movement, barely noticeable, like a shadow shifting against the rock. My dad must have seen it too because he froze, his body going rigid. Then, two pale eyes opened in the darkness. Not the soft reflection of an animal's eyes catching the light. These were dull, almost milky, like they had never seen the sun. They blinked once, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging us. My breath caught in my throat. My dad took a step back, muttering, "What in the hell?" under his breath. Before either of us could react, a sound rose from the crevice, a low, wet exhale, like air passing through something that hadn't breathed in a very long time. The eyes never moved, just stared, unblinking, as if waiting for us to do something. My dad didn't wait to find out what was in there. He took another step back, raising the rifle to his shoulder. "Who's in there?" he called out, his voice firm but edged with something I had never heard before: uncertainty. No response. Just the eyes, locked onto us, unblinking. My pulse pounded in my ears. The air felt heavier, like the woods themselves were pressing in on us. Then, before I could process what was happening, my dad fired. The shot echoed through the trees, sending a flock of unseen birds scattering into the sky. For a moment, there was silence. I expected to hear something: movement, a cry of pain, anything. But the crevice remained still, the darkness swallowing whatever was inside. My dad, breathing hard, took another step forward, peering inside. And then, as if answering him, the footprints, those same bare footprints, started appearing in the dirt behind us. One after another, pressed into the soil by something we couldn't see. My dad turned so fast he nearly dropped the rifle. I could feel it now, the presence of something standing right behind us, breathing down my neck. I didn't think I just ran. My dad was right behind me, his boots slamming against the dirt as we tore through the trees. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sound of footsteps followed us, heavy and deliberate, but there was no sound of movement through the brush, no snapping twigs, no rustling leaves. Just those damn footsteps keeping pace with us. My lungs burned as we reached the clearing near our house. My dad skidded to a stop, spun around, and aimed his rifle back at the tree line. But there was nothing. No footprints, no movement. Just the quiet, yawning mouth of the woods, as if we had imagined the whole thing. We didn't speak as we rushed inside, locking every door and window. My mom and sister looked at us, confused and alarmed, but my dad just shook his head. "Stay inside," was all he said. That night, nobody slept. We sat in the living room, lights on, the rifle resting across my dad's lap. And then, just before dawn, we heard it. Slow, dragging footsteps circling the house. My mom clutched my sister close, her breath shallow. My dad gripped the rifle tighter, but he didn't move. We all listened as the footsteps came to a stop right outside the front door. For what felt like an eternity, we just sat there, frozen. The air in the house was thick with fear, every creak of the wood settling under our weight, sounding impossibly loud. My dad's knuckles were white around the rifle, his eyes locked on the door. Then 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not loud, not frantic, just steady, like whoever or whatever was out there knew we were awake, knew we were listening. My mom let out a small gasp, muffling it with her hand. My sister buried her face against her shoulder, trembling. My dad stood up, moving toward the door as if pulled by some unseen force. "Don't," my mom whispered, but he ignored her. He raised his free hand and ever so slowly turned the lock. The click echoed through the silent house. Then, with one deep breath, he swung the door open. Nothing. Just the empty porch, the cool pre-dawn air rolling in. But there was something new: the footprints. They started right there at the door, bare and deep, and led away from the house, disappearing into the tree line. My dad stepped onto the porch, scanning the yard. That's when he noticed it, something resting on the wooden planks, right where the footprints began. A single human tooth. None of us spoke. My dad just stood there, staring down at that tooth like it was some kind of warning. My mom finally found her voice. "Get inside," she whispered harshly, her eyes wide with fear. My dad didn't argue. He stepped back in, locked the door, and slid the deadbolt shut. Nobody slept after that. When the sun finally rose, my dad went out again, this time with me and our old farm dog, Rusty. We followed the footprints as far as we could, back through the woods, past the barn, and toward the rocky hills. They led just like before straight to that narrow crevice. But this time, something was different. The footprints didn't go inside. They just stopped. There was no sign of movement, no more tracks leading away. Just the last lonely print pressed deep into the dirt, right at the entrance of the crack in the rock. My dad didn't hesitate this time. He raised the rifle, took aim, and fired 3 more rounds straight into the darkness. The sound of the shots echoed, then faded, swallowed by the silence of the hills. Rusty growled low in his throat, the fur along his back standing up. My dad exhaled sharply, then muttered, "We're sealing this up." And that's exactly what we did. That afternoon, he and a couple of hired hands from a neighboring farm hauled heavy stones and cement to the site. We filled the gap, covering it completely, turning that narrow crevice into nothing more than another pile of rocks. After that, the footprints stopped. No more strange tracks in the morning, no more eerie knocks at the door. It was as if whatever had been watching us had simply given up or had been trapped inside those rocks for good. My dad never talked about it again, and neither did my mom. But I could tell it stayed with them. My dad started keeping the rifle by the door at all times, and my mom would double-check the locks every night, even though nothing ever happened again. Years later, after my dad passed and I took over the farm, I found myself drawn back to that spot. The rocks were still there, undisturbed, just as we had left them. But as I stood there, staring at the place where the crevice used to be, a cold feeling settled in my chest, like I wasn't alone. Like something behind that stone barrier still knew I was there. I didn't stay long. I turned and walked away, resisting the urge to look back. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought I heard something in the distance, a slow, deliberate knocking, carrying through the trees.